you're able to do that. But I wanted to ask you, first of all, of this notion of writing. How many of you have experienced that sense that either you or the cohort around you, you're kind of surprised that they don't write more effectively than they do? Or is that something that you're just all kind of used to? I'm generally puzzled by it, but I'm generally interested in it. How about something more than just a thumbs up? For example, how many of you find yourselves being in any way troubled by the writing expectations of university? I am at times surprised by the writing level of college students. Well, Shelby, that could mean one of two things. That could mean either you're surprised that so much is demanded of students, or you can be saying, I'm surprised that students, generally speaking, aren't better writers. Which would it be?
I would say the APA style, which is what most of the professors here expect of us, is something different for me. So that's something that I just learned coming into the school. But I wouldn't say it's very hard. I would just say I'm not provided with enough information on how to write correctly in the APA style at times.
Okay, but the APA, that's the American Psychological Association, actually it's only a style that's primarily that primarily has to do with the way that you cite sources. It's not a different way of writing, okay? It is a different way of citing your sources. And there are the old Chicago Manual of Style, Turabian, things like that. There were all these various ways of writing and ways of citing sources that had developed over the years. But what I'm more interested in is just the ability, the comfort level of students in assembling an understanding of what they can glean from reading, first of all, which is a challenge, and then translating that into written expression. In other words, I was assigned these readings. If you look at Module 1, there's this thing on structural functionalism and the civic culture and new institutionalism, rational choice, okay? And I had an assignment, and let's say the assignment asks me to take any two of those sources and look over them, and none of them is terribly long, but look through them and think, okay, first of all, what's the most important thing that the author or authors want me to learn? And then secondly, how does that relate to the study of comparative politics? Your ability to do that. So a couple of you mentioned, I saw the one point, I'm sorry, because I turned the chat off so that I can see everybody in screen, but I'm going to actually turn it back on. Let's see. So let me go back into chat. Let's see. I've noticed a lack of, this is Caden, I've noticed a lack of critical reading. People more skim than truly read, such as when we read Heart of Darkness in my senior year in English last year. Yeah, no one seemed to wish to read it, citing the language as being too difficult. So it resulted in only a small handful of students actually reading the work. Let's start with that. How common an experience is that for you? And feel free to open your mics and speak, okay? Keeping in mind, this is being recorded.
I don't know if anybody wants to speak.
Well, you're there and you're speaking.
So I'm here and I have a camera on or something like that. Soon to be improved, but we'll get to that later. Yeah. But there are definitely some classes, at least in college, that I feel like, I normally talk a decent amount. If you don't know me, hello. But I'll have to carry conversations because it feels like there are only a couple people talking, and either people are too shy to speak up or they just haven't read in the first place. And sometimes it's hard to tell which one it is, but also it's well, you should have something to add to this point, because if you read the reading, you'd know that this point is important, kind of thing. And it's there isn't, in addition to that, or something like that, I guess.
Okay, this is another point from observation from Caden. It's saying, I think that lack of critical reading texts leads to people not writing in styles that would develop from that reading. Can you explain what you mean there? Because that sounds interesting.
Yeah, so I've noticed from just back when I was in high school, people wouldn't really do a lot of reading past a certain point. So some people, they'd stop reading books freshman year, just start skimming, like Spark Notes or whatever, and you didn't really see their writing develop past that. So if we were reading, I don't know, Macbeth, for example, the people who actually read it could go more in depth into the thoughts and nuances behind it, whereas the people who skimmed would only cover surface level and basically like summarizing it. There was no depth of understanding. That's what I've noticed, at least.
Okay.
And then because they never continue reading further past a specific point, their style of writing tends to stay the same as it is from whenever they generally stopped. It never develops more. You never see a different shift in their narrative tone as they write, like papers, for example.
Right. That's an excellent observation. One of the things that I've noticed, and I mentioned this to a couple students in a previous class, when Paul Pavlich retired, and Paul up until this year had been my colleague for like 25 years. And he finally retired. He was in an office that used to be mine. I mean, we were both like these fossils who just sort of grow like moss in the building. And what happened was that there were some boxes in there that had written assignments from classes that I taught back, right around 1999, 2000, 2001. And it gave me an interesting opportunity. It was like an archaeological dig, and I got to go through and read those things. One of the things I noticed was, and this is to Caden's point, I think, was that students were writing then at a more sophisticated level. They, on average, I mean, there were varying degrees of skill, but on average, I would say that the papers demonstrated a pretty clear comfort on the page with most students. And the indication was that they had, in fact, continued to read through high school. But I've looked at some recent research, and there have been some studies of American students nationally that suggest that, and this is an overwhelming trend apparently, students in middle school actually read more in their assignments and read more on their own than students in high school. And this is, I think, what Caden is suggesting, is that, your level of writing and your level of comprehension and the ability to make sense of others' writing continues to evolve insofar as you continue to do it. But if you stopped at the 6th to 7th or 8th grade level, that's where you're going to stay. And the challenge there is, well, what happens when let's say you don't go to college, what happens when you go out in the workforce and you're expected to be able to communicate on the page? We're seeing what happens. People can't communicate on the page. I was looking at examples, working on a manuscript with somebody. And part of it was an analysis of people's writing in various private sector professions and how they wrote memos and things like that. There was no syntax, there was no grammar, there was no nothing. And most of what they wrote had no specific meaning. You had to be intuitive to understand what people were saying. That's not the function of language. Properly understood, the function of language is for us to be able to transmit what we understand as a picture in our head to someone else's head, so that they can, whether they agree with it or not, they're able to see something like that same picture. That's why we use language. That's why we use written speech. That's why we speak and things like that. But it seems to me that that's something that's it's more challenging to demonstrate the relevance of that now. I didn't used to have to try to prove that being able to read and write was valuable. It was something that was taken as a given. Does that make sense? Because here's why I bring it up. And I'm doing different things in different classes. One of the things I'm thinking about with this class is partly because for most of you, the material will not be something that is intrinsically interesting to you. Again, based on a lot of research, the overwhelming majority of college-age Americans are not interested in the rest of the world. I'm just saying, you may be, but generally speaking, your age cohort right now is not interested much in history and not interested in much in the rest of the world and what's really going on. That's important because when we talk a lot about diversity and culture and things like that, that presupposes an interest in the rest of the world, either across space or across time. But the facts on the ground suggest that the reality is significantly different from that. So what I have to think about is, okay, how do I make the material relevant for you? And how do I make it comprehensible for you? I actually, some of you, if you look closely at the syllabus, which was revised last night, right? I revise classes constantly through the breaks, right? Since that revision, I've revised the Moodle site. I've eliminated a couple of readings and added a couple of other readings because I'm trying to figure out, okay, which ones are they going to be able to make use of? Which ones are going to be useful to them? Okay, it's an ongoing challenge. Okay, now here's another thing. The last two comments have to do with time. Shelby says, I enjoy reading as long as time allows me to. Caden says, I think time is the largest issue. People's time is separated between so many things, especially now. People would rather hang out with friends, play games, and watch television. Well, my response to that really is then get out of college. All right. And I don't mean to be mean, but, you know, it's like telling your boss, well, you know what? I would have done better on that, but I was really busy hanging out with my friends, playing games and watching television. You're fired. You know, that way D's lie, F's lie. It's true. You're not, most of you, really genuinely busy. I'm going to suggest as a hypothesis, you're not busy so much as you're preoccupied. That's a hypothesis. I'm not dismissing you. I'm saying, what do you think of that? The idea that you make choices about whether or not you're going to concentrate on your schoolwork and take your studies seriously, or you're going to take that same energy and get into some interesting games or some interesting music or some interesting hanging out with friends or whatever else you do. Those are choices. Or are they not? What do you think? God, I'm just seeing a sea of dead screens and dead microphones with about 2 people whose screens are going.
I think that has to do a lot with work ethic, choices that we make outside of our classroom, whether we choose to study and prepare for the materials before class and turn in our assignments on time. But I think hanging out with your friends and wanting to socialize also interferes with that and affects your ability to do that. But that's a choice you make. If you're in college, obviously your choice should be to be accountable for all your work. You're paying to go to an institution. You're just flushing money down the drain at this point. So I think you're right to say that if you're more interested in hanging out with friends, you probably shouldn't be in college.
Well, one of the things that we know that has happened in the last year, we've really seen it at SOU, is a lot of students have made a conscious choice. I'm not going back, right? I mean, look at the enrollment in this class used to be 25. Now it's the official enrollment in this class is either 9 or 10. And right now, what do we got? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people here. Okay. This is a basic class on comparative politics. At any university, anywhere, this thing would have a minimum of 20 students, somewhere between 20 and 300, depending on the size of the university. Okay. But across the board, you know, we're seeing that. And especially, as I say, the classes that I offer now that are more focused on the rest of the world rather than, I used to teach nothing but American. And those classes generally enrolled really well. Last year, I made the transition to international stuff, and all of a sudden the class sizes are just tiny. And the international studies major is just tiny. Those are consequences of people's choices. But it does kind of pose this problem of, okay, well, how can I do my job? How can anybody, you know, in this field, how can we do our jobs when students don't see value in that? You know, it's getting, you know, that's becoming the challenge is how do I establish for you as a premise that learning how to compare socio-political systems around the world is valuable to you and something from which you can learn useful things?
The thing I don't. Oh,
Sorry. I was say that one of the problems of class size and students leaving is because we've gone remote and we're not in class anymore interacting with people. I think humans need a basic social need to interact with other humans, and being on the computer doesn't help with that, but also making the material more interesting and making us want to interact with each other on it would help with the class.
Well, yeah, but it begs the question, how does one do that? It's, if you think about that, there are only so many perspectives that you can show on structural functionalism or, you know, the civic culture or new institutionalism or rational choice or the questions of development, because those are adult concerns. Those are the concerns of serious, thoughtful adults. And they're often sort of pragmatic choices that people make. They're real life choices, but trying to teach those often can be off-putting for people because it's like, well, where's the drama in this? You know, where are the people in this? Who do I care about? Because if you look at increasingly at what's called the news, for example, you'll find that increasingly the focus is not on data. The focus is not on information, what happened, or even what does it mean. There's always this scramble to find the sort of human element. And the problem is when you're in a discipline like a social science discipline, the human element can't be interpreted properly unless you first acquire the structural discipline to make sense of that, you know, the context within which to observe people's behavior. I think a lot of students now really struggle with the idea that they can't just make blanket assertions or claims and then have those be taken as serious and relevant. You know, you can't just say, well, every system is just as good or bad as every other one, there, end of discussion. Well, that on its face is a nonsense statement. It means nothing. Good in how? Good in what? I mean, you know, what's the difference between the so-called first world and third world? And what's the second world and all that? Most Americans don't know that stuff. But we throw those terms out all the time, you know. So part of the challenge here is, how do I get you to take a deeper look at this? All right. The first thing to do is to get you to care. The one mechanism that's supposed to get you to care, one of them Kat already mentioned, is you paid for this, or somebody paid for this on your behalf, one way or another. Okay. In fact, many of you are going into debt for this. Normally you would think, wow, all that money's been spent, I better take this seriously. But we know that that's not always a good incentive for people to study, especially something as apparently esoteric as, you know, comparative politics. But another part of it is, well, can I monetize this? How is this going to get me a better job? How is this going to improve the material circumstances of my life? Right? I mean, that's a legitimate concern. Well, on the face of it, you might look at a class like this and say, well, it's not going to. I mean, I don't need this nonsense. You know, I don't need to know what's going on in the rest of the world. You know, I need to get into a profession that's going to pay me a six-figure income. I'm still waiting to find that, by the way. So the first thing I want to ask you today, by way of getting into this, okay, is why did you enroll in this class?
I enrolled in this class personally because my grandfather was European. He was German, and he always stressed the importance of external politics. So mainly as he got older, he cited the issue of the Chinese. Like he said, the Russians would still be a threat, although that's more from his background as soldier than Marine, so on and so forth. And I find the development of politics to be interesting, especially the shift the Americans are taking now to start to shift more towards isolationism, similar to how they did in the 30s.
Yeah, except that that's not really much of a shift. The American people have always been pretty isolationist. American leadership for most of the last century and a half has not been isolationist.
American leadership hasn't, but the people are starting to be more isolational.
No, the American people have always been. That's my point. If you look at American history, Americans don't want to fight. Americans don't want to go fix the rest of the world. We're not interested in it now. We never have been. But American leadership, particularly American business leadership, sees tremendous value in that.
Yeah, and things such as the development of NATO, with the United States funding it, so much of it. And I find the difference between that to be interesting.
Yeah.
Like the interest in policing the world by the people, and then the interest of it by businesses, people in power, things of that nature.
Okay. What about anybody else? Reasons for enrolling in this particular class? It was all that was left.
I would say one, because it was a requirement for my major, and two, because politics is something that actually interests me, and I find it very important considering that politics governs people and controls basically what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do and the quality of our lives. So that's something that I'd actually like to know more about.
Okay. Anything else?
I took this class because, unlike what you said, I'm pretty interested in the rest of the world. I'm majoring in international studies, and I saw comparative politics and read the description. I thought it'd be a good class to take, and I've taken classes from you before, so I like your teaching style.
Okay. All right.
Entire
So
major for fun at this point. So
what's that?
I'm taking the entire major for fun. At least that was my original path. So here we are.
I think it's become an official policy that if I offer a class now, Kyle has to take it, much to Kyle's chagrin. All right. What I'm going to do is we're going to improvise a little bit here. All right. But not in some haphazard way that confuses you. But we're going to try to do things a little differently in terms of how we articulate the consequences of what you study. All right. Now, normally the way the class is structured is something like this, okay? What we do is each of you would present in class some part of one of the readings. Some of the readings are longer, like this. The overview on structural functionalism, I think, is short. It's like 3 pages. That would be one person, but sorry, my system's running real slow. There's a chapter out of the civic culture. That's more like 20 pages. That would probably take at least 2 people, all right? In other words, you would lead a discussion of that, okay? And we're going to do that. In the modules where you do that, and you'll notice there are 5 modules in the class, each of them approximately 2 weeks long, okay? In the modules where you present, you don't write a complete paper. In other words, I evaluate you on your demonstrated facility with the material, just sort of leading a discussion of it, which is every bit as valuable as writing about it. It's just a different way to communicate it, okay? But the challenge is not that, okay? Most of you can kind of fake that. The challenge is when you have to write about it, because some of these concepts and some of these academic writings about these concepts, this is an upper division university course, okay? That means we can't really be that simplistic anymore the way we could in an introductory class. It presupposes that you've acquired a certain conceptual facility. Okay, I can talk in an informed way about politics because I did pretty well in political science 201 and 202, and I'm kind of figuring this thing out. That's the way it should work, but it doesn't always. Okay, so what I'm going to do is you will have a writing assignment. Okay. And I'll explain the details of those. There's also a kind of a writing sample. But what I've noticed with that is, and for all the reasons we've talked about, when students look at that writing sample, it seems to just either frighten them or confuse them, because it's like college level writing, okay? And I think a lot of you, unfortunately, get intimidated by the idea that there's a standard of writing that you're expected to meet, that you find that distressing, that creates anxiety, either because you don't think you can do it, that might be the primary reason, or because you just don't want to. Again, I'd rather A, hang out with my friends, B, watch TV, and preparing to write takes time. It does, okay? So what we're gonna do, at least for the first writing assignment, is everybody's gonna do an assignment. Okay, and then I'm going to cut and paste bits from that assignment, put them into a single document. Okay, and I'm going to post that document. Your names won't be on there, and no one will know whose writing is whose. All right, nobody worry about getting embarrassed or anything. Okay, and what I'm going to want you to do is look at the material of your colleagues and try to fix it, try to edit it. And you'll notice some of your own there. And then we're going to take some time and discuss that in class. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to arrange at some point early in the term to meet with each of you individually to talk about your approach to the class, your ability to deal with the literature, and your ability to write. And I'm going to find out where the class is. The best way to do that is individually. Okay. Now, I have a normal office hour every day from noon to 1, but I'm available throughout the week. And if nothing else, I'm often available on the weekend, even though, sometimes I have to force myself to kind of take a day off. The biggest challenge from me in this class is finding out where everyone is in terms of the level of comprehension and then teaching to that level without making it an introductory class. Okay, it is a challenge. Okay, so keep all that in mind. It sounds more complicated than it really is, but what we'll do is for the next, the rest of this class, and then more importantly, the next class, okay, will be in the module 1 readings. And I think what we'll do is for the first module, no one will present, everyone will write. I will do the summaries of all the readings for the first module, okay? And then you'll have an opportunity to do 1 or 2. You can't do more than 2 presentations. That is more than 2 substitutes for writing. You're gonna have to write at least a couple of papers, okay? Then what we'll do is after next week's class, there will be I'll post the guidelines for the first written assignment based on what we emphasized in class. I'll give you a deadline by which time to complete that and have it due. We'll put that document up and we'll look at it in class. I'll give you a chance to look at it in advance, but we'll look at it in class and we'll spend part of the next class period after the assignment's due, just looking at those fragments of writing and trying to figure out, well, is this clear? What does this mean? How could this be made stronger? I find that sometimes helps. It's a variation on what's called peer editing, where you allow your colleagues to help edit your work, okay? But because I'm just taking pieces of people's writing, it's not like your ego is invested in it. You don't feel vulnerable the way you would often when you had to stand up in front of class and have your work criticized, which I always found to be kind of appalling. So I'm going to avoid that as much as I can. I don't want anyone to have that kind of level of stress. I just don't think that's necessary or appropriate. So far, does this make sense, what we're going to do in terms of the writing? Do you have any questions about that? As I say, it sounds more complicated than it really is. Okay, another thing that I'm going to ask you to do is if you don't have a camera, get a camera. Okay, I don't want to look at any more blank screens because I need to know who's actually here and who's actually listening. Okay, so if you have a camera, turn it on. If you're in a situation now where you didn't clean your room and it's messy, that's cool, but clean your room before the next class, okay? Because I need to know who's here and I need to know that you're paying attention. Again, I'm not taking it personally. It's really, I think Kat had mentioned earlier how it's kind of alienating to be on camera instead of being us sort of rolling around in a classroom. I think it's important that you have even virtual eye contact with people, that you're able to see people when you're talking to them. And talking to a blank screen can be very, very uninspiring and a little bit disturbing, okay? So by next week, I expect everyone to have a camera and to have it activated. There really isn't any reason for that. It is the 21st century. You all have or can get cameras. They're very cheap. You're in college. You didn't have to pay a penny for the texts for this class. Take the money, a fraction of the money you would have spent, and get a webcam. The webcam I'm using right now costs $27. Okay, I think you can all cut that. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Let me just first give you an overview of the first module, and then we'll talk more specifically about the readings next week. Okay, and since it's the first class, we've been here about half an hour. This is going to take about another 15 minutes, and you're going to be done. Okay. Sometimes we'll finish early. Some of you have had classes with me before and, it's scheduled for like an hour and 50 minutes. We might go an hour and 10 and we're done. Sometimes we need that hour and 50. So I don't care. If you have questions, I will continue to answer them. But if we've kind of gone as far as we can go, or the room feels kind of flat like it does today, there's no point pushing it. If people aren't engaged, they're not going to remember anyway. Why waste the time? But what I want you to think about then for this first module is in this general discipline of comparative politics, as opposed to American politics or international relations, international studies, whatever, but specific to comparative politics, there were some significant breakthroughs in the wake of the Second World War, as there were in many things, partly as a consequence of changes in developments in technology and the development of computers, the development, borrowing from psychology and mass marketing, of survey research as a technique for information gathering and analysis. No, there are no exams. The exams are fraudulent. You know, to me, exams are tricks that dogs do, you know, for which they get a treat. I don't mean that to be mean. It's just that I think exams, you know, it's like I don't give finals. I think finals, you know, look, we used to have in my day, you know, like there's an expression I thought I'd never use in my day. My God, shoot me, please. But we used to have to sit in class in a lecture hall with maybe like 250 students, right? With a little blue book, like a paper book, and write essays. I can't write. It looks like I wrote with my feet. You know, it's just, I started typing when I was 15. And since then I did not evolve penmanship. I can't write. Some of you've seen this if you've seen me in class. I can't write legibly on a board. I can't. I have to like a child, you know. I look like I'm writing with the wrong hand, okay? But anyway, no, we're not going to do that. Exams create unnecessary anxiety. The materials, I want them to be there for you. I want you to think less like a student performing tricks and more like a researcher responding to materials. I just think that's more useful. Yeah, there you go. It would be a history teacher, wouldn't it? Yeah, they're so old school. God, I wonder if Sean McEnroe uses blue books. He's gonna hate me. All right, so it was a figure. This people called it a revolution. Although it's just revolution. What kind? It was called a behavioral revolution, and the idea was we can figure out, we can do a lot better at political science. We can actually make it a science. And the way we can do that is that we can take advantage of these new information gathering and analysis technologies and methodologies. We can use this new stuff, much of which was developed out of the imperatives of the Second World War. And we can actually develop massive data sets, and we can analyze those data statistically, qualitatively and quantitatively. We can analyze those data and we can draw conclusions from those data being observational, right? And from those we can build theories, and we can actually make a science of the study of politics, okay? It didn't work out very well. It certainly isn't terribly scientific, but it is more rigorous than it was before. So the first question is, what was wrong? What was wrong with political science that compelled these big revolutionary changes? The primary concern was that political science wasn't scientific, and that it really didn't do much, and that after 2,000 years of analyzing politics, at least going back as far as, you know, Plato and Aristotle, we hadn't really evolved very much. We were still kind of largely descriptive, you know, and even there, we weren't really accurately descriptive, because often we were what is sometimes referred to as normative. What does it mean when something is normative, like a statement is normative or an approach is normative? What does that mean, to be normative?
Or normative implies a value judgment, effectively.
Right. Yes. Good, bad, right, wrong, whatever. So that when you look, for example, at political philosophy, all right, you'll find that pretty much everything there is just the perspective of the writer, based often on a very selective analysis of a kind of history, in order often to prove a point that that particular philosopher already happens to agree with, okay? But based on, ultimately, is this good? Is this bad? Is this right? Is this wrong? Those are normative assessments. So the idea was, because it is excessively normative, it's not even accurately descriptive, right? So instead of just doing comparative analyses of the different constitutions of nation states, people talked about, well, this is how that constitution is meant to work. Well, that doesn't tell us anything at all about how it does work. So that was the first thing. It was, the discipline was incredibly subjective. It was incredibly normatively skewed and imbalanced. Also, it wasn't authentically comparative. That most of the theories and ideas, almost all of them really, were derived from exclusively one intellectual tradition, you know, the Western intellectual tradition. And that the existing tools of description, even of politics, didn't apply to most of the world. You couldn't apply them to Asia. You couldn't apply them to sub-Saharan Africa. You couldn't apply those models to the Middle East. You couldn't really apply them anywhere except Western Europe and the United States, and North America. They just didn't work. So for a lot of reasons, we hadn't learned very much about what politics actually is or how it actually works in 2,000 years of saying we were doing it. Okay, so that's the first thing. Any questions there so far on what we're talking about? Most of this is, it was just historical, but it wasn't even really historical, or it's prescriptive. This is the way people should live. Think of Plato's Republic, this idea that, well, there's a right way for people to do things, and they should achieve a certain balance, or they should know what their nature is and follow that nature, or whatever it was. Okay, well, who says that we should know our nature and follow that nature? I thought we were supposed to be, empowered beings, and autonomous individuals. Should I just follow my nature, or should I discover, what I can do? And is that the same thing as following my nature? Political science, and especially comparative politics, couldn't deal with those questions at all, especially as they pertain to public decision-making, which, as Kat pointed out earlier, is the way that we decide who gets to do what, okay? So in order to address that, the first commitment was that the discipline would become more, not imperial, that's often a misunderstanding, would become more empirical. What does it mean for a discipline to be more empirical, with an E, empirical? Somebody I haven't heard from yet. The concept of being empirical. I mean, you have the great advantage sitting at your computers that you have access to Google. You can sound smart. What is an empirical discipline? Let me write out the word so you can cut and paste it into Google.
I think I might know. Is it just like something that's based off of your observation?
Just your observation?
Yeah, like an observation or experience that you've had. Is that what empirical is? Or maybe I'm thinking of something.
That would be a really simplistic version of it, but there's nothing scientific about that because it's radically subjective. But you're in the right ballpark.
Okay.
In other words, the problem with early writings about politics was that they really were just the perspective of one individual, making decisions based on how they affect people through observation rather than guessing. That's much more. So the idea of empiricism, of being empirical, is using systematic observation. Okay, so you're not just kind of looking at things and thinking, oh, I like that. That's the way things should be. You're looking systematically. I'll give you an example of how this sometimes works. All right, I've got to get rid of my cup here. Several years ago, I was teaching survey research. And one of the things that I did was I was trying to teach people the empirical method. And what I had them do was go out in front of the college on Siskiyou Boulevard. And this was before the lights, the crossing lights were in there that you can bump with your elbow now because you don't want to get virus off of them. And lights will come on and a little voice usually says to cross and gives you a countdown or something like that. They've kind of taken away some of that, right? So cars now have something to see that they're supposed to stop for. Well, at this time, they didn't have that. And so one of the things I did was I set up several teams of people. Think about this as a method, right? It's based on observation, that's systematic. It's got built-in controls. This was actually a controlled experiment. I had different teams go out, and of that team, they would send out to cross the street a single male or a single female, okay? Or two people who were both male, or two people who were both female, or a group of people. And what we were looking for was, and somebody had a digital stopwatch, and we would do this several times, repeated observations, right? with under different circumstances to see what changes. You're testing assumptions, okay? And what we would do is time how long, if it's a single person, two people, male, female, whatever, how long does it take people to stop? How many cars will go by? How long do you have to wait before people stop for you? Because what we were testing a hypothesis. This is an important part of empiricism, which makes observations systematic. Okay, in other words, I'm going to frame a question, then I'm going to go out and observe the phenomena related to that question and see if I can come up with an answer and see if, you know, my response to that is right. Okay, and so what do you think we found? What was the shortest period of time for people to wait? One person, two people, both the same gender, two people, different gender, group of people. What were the shortest waiting times? You see how I'm framing a research question. Here's my hypothesis. In other words, my educated guess. Because more people will be more observable, that should be the shortest waiting time. It shouldn't matter what the composition of the group is. They're simply more visible. In other words, 5 people are easier to see than 1. Okay, what do you think we found? Exactly that. Where 4 or 5 people would go up in a group, people would stop pretty much right away and let them go. What was the longest waiting time, do you think? Caden says single male. That's right. Now, then, this is what, you know, insofar as this is political science, we've tested the assumption, you know, we had this hypothesis, well, because a single person is harder to see than a group of people. But also, there was a significant difference between how long a single woman had to wait or a single man. It was statistically significant in terms of time, okay? So then what the discipline is supposed to be able to do is not merely describe that, but explain it. Why would that be? Think about this as an exercise in political culture. And, you know, in other words, it's an exercise in what we value, but it is not itself normative. It's not informed by values. It's informed by objective curiosity, insofar as we can be objective. Why do you think it would be that a single male would have to wait significantly longer than any of the other cohorts, including 2 men? A, not as visible. Let's see. People are taught to be kinder to women and to treat them with more respect than men. Sort of. The idea being men can sort it out themselves. Women need help. You know, I mean, you know, it's an old school thing. Is it accurate? No, not necessarily. But it is a way that people raised a generation of people to kind of behave. So you see what we're doing? We're using however imperfectly, we're using systematic observation and measurement in order to try to answer questions using data, available data. Does that make sense? Okay. So the idea is this is the direction the discipline was going to go in now and forever. And there were some initial studies that tried this. Let's see. Where I was from, if a woman was walking alone along the road, it was expected of a man to pick them up and drive them to where they were. You're going to get arrested if you do that now. I mean, you know, really, not a good idea. But I understand, yeah. Well, think of it this way. You know, another studies like this have been done. But just think of this as, okay, we're going to talk about power and gender. That is the social identity of someone. Forget their sexuality, just the recognized attributed social identity, male, female, okay? Just if the world was binary, which up until relatively recently was the way that most human beings treated it, whether they should have or not, okay? It's 2 o'clock in the morning and 2 people are going to walk out of a bar. Okay, one of them is me. The other one is a 22-year-old woman. Who's safer? Emma, if you're talking, I can't hear you. I saw your box light up. I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say the man.
Yeah, but I'm
Okay.
old and you can't tell, but I'm tiny. I'm like a scale model human being. I'm tiny.
Can you repeat the question again?
Who's safer? Me walking out of a bar at 2 a.m. or a 22, I think I said a 22-year-old woman.
You.
Okay, because think of it. I'm this doddering little tiny man, you know, unescorted, all by my lonesome, as opposed to someone who's just entering the prime of life, probably in the best shape they're ever going to be in, who happens to be a woman, who very likely could be bigger than me. I'm that small. Why would I be safer than a young woman?
Because you're a man?
Well, okay, but you see how
It's-
that doesn't really explain that?
Women are more likely to be attacked if they're walking alone at night.
But why would, in other words, if you want something from someone, if you want their money, wouldn't you go after the little tiny old man?
I mean, possibly, but there's also the idea that there's also women are more likely to be targeted by sexual assault, and if it's a man targeting her, they're probably going to think that she's less likely to fight back.
Okay, so you see what we're doing is we're using initial observation of a phenomenon, you know, the getting out of the bar at 2 a.m. Most of you, I'm sure, had in your picture some clear idea. Well, Bill, yeah, they wouldn't mess with you because nobody cares. You got nothing anybody wants. Okay, whatever the decision is, every one of you had, I think, the same picture in your head. The more vulnerable person is not, you know, a middle-aged man, it's a young woman, right? So then the question is why? I mean, I thought we were supposed to be civilized. In a civilized society, should that be the case?
In theory, no, but here we are.
Do you see the difference between the way comparative politics was carried out for 2,000 years and the way we're doing it now? Right? The normative political philosopher would have said, well, in theory, you see, everyone is equal. Either that, or more likely, as was often the case, that same philosopher who was overwhelmingly likely to be male would try to explain the inferiority of women or the superiority of men. You know, you see the extreme, like radical subjectivity, right? Well, of course they would do that, you know, because, you know, men are powerful and women are weak and women are hysterical and men don't need help. I mean, those things, by the way, were common in most of the analysis of power as it relates to gender for 2,000 years everywhere in the world. Now, there might have been little trumped up things about, well, show respect or do this or do that. But, you know, if just think about the discrimination of thinking, well, if I'm driving along and I see a woman walking by herself, I should offer her a ride, but I shouldn't do that with a man. You know what? My feet get sore too. I get tired too. You know, I'm not a bigger fan of walking than anyone else just because I'm a man. But you see, we make these discriminate choices, and these discriminate choices impact the power structure within which we live. They underpin it completely. It's the base on which our society is built. The fundamental assumptions about who is or is not or ought not to be or ought to be powerful. Okay? Does this make sense? So the idea with developing political science and using this new empiricism, and indeed, radically, it's often called positivism, the idea that the only way you can be sure of something is systematic measurement and repeated measurement again and again and again, replication of findings. Okay, you went out and did that experiment with some people, Bill. Let me go out and do the same experiment. If we do it the same way and it's a valid experiment, I should get pretty much the same results. Okay, that's what empiricism enforces on you. The idea that, they couldn't replicate our findings. One of us is wrong. See, if you're just writing in an ivory tower as a philosopher, you don't have to worry about that. You can just tell someone, oh, you're mistaken. But if the data say, something's wrong here, this is what the behavioral revolution was about. Things would be based in empiricism, systematic observation, analysis of available data, positing hypotheses, building theories. Right? So theory building becomes very important. And so when we get into, oh, I did it just about right because I'm just about done. I said it'd take about 15 minutes. It's more like 20, but that's all right. What we're going to be looking at in Module 1 are some of the ways that people began to frame the questions politically and interpret existing data. Because the thing is, it wasn't a single revolution. Not everyone was on the same page. Yeah, we all agreed we need more data, we need better analysis, we need to improve methods. But what we see here is we see some different ways of doing it. So the first module in the class, first of all, there's this overview of structural functionalism, and I'll explain a little bit what structural functionalism was. By the way, here's one thing you don't want to do if you want to do well in this class. Don't wait until after the class in which I explain something to actually go read it, because you won't remember what I said, or you won't read it, one or the other. Okay, so by next class, you should have glanced at least all 4 of the listed writings. You should make notes. If you have questions as you're reading through them, if you see something you don't understand, write it down and ask me about it at the beginning of class. Okay? That's your responsibility. So that's where I will know, okay, they didn't really get this. When we got to the article on new institutionalism, there was this kind of institutionalism that no one understood. Maybe I better, okay, I'll explain that. Or email me in advance of that and say, hey, I'm reading through the new institutionalism article. Let me get to it and I'll give you an example. And there's this stuff called historical institutionalism. And it seems to be this and this and this. But then there's this other thing, let me get to it, that's called rational choice institutionalism. Okay, well, I don't really understand what that is. My first response is going to be, did you read the article on rational choice? Okay, so there is a thing called rational choice institutionalism. If you want to make sense of it, you'll notice magically I've put a writing in there on rational choice. Okay, so you might want to take a look at that. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put the rational choice one first. First read rational choice, then read new institutionalism. All right, so is it clear what I'm asking you to do by this time next week? Okay, take a look at all 4 of the readings, make notes, begin to make notes. Now, in some of the other classes that I teach, students are required to enter notes via Moodle in a little journal. Okay, I'm using different methods to find, I'm using that empirical method. I'm gathering data, using the classes to develop data. Okay. And so I'm not going to have you do that, but I'm going to have at least one of my other classes do that, where they're going to be entering notes. And they're actually going to be graded in part on those notes. Okay. You don't have to do that. So between now and about this time, or 1:30 next week, you should be able to get through all 4 of those. And remember, none of you is that busy. You don't have that many calls upon your time. I don't think any of you are working 50-hour weeks. If you are, you really don't want to be in college. It's not worth it. That's not a normative statement. That's just you're hurting yourself in a way that you shouldn't. You're not going to have time to do upper division work. But I don't think any of you are. Okay, so make time, budget your time. Time management is a big part of success in a university, especially in upper division classes, where all of a sudden a little bit more is demanded of you. Okay. Any questions on anything we've talked about so far, or what I'm asking you to do right now? Okay, Caden, you're saying you work from 9 to 5 at Coast Aluminum. That's your choice. I worked full-time all the way through college, and I managed to keep current with everything, and I ain't exactly a Superman, Yeah, and I did the same. That's how I paid for college. I had a great gig, though, because I worked on the grounds crew on the campus. So that was, I just go in there all stinky and sweaty from working in 100-degree weather and sitting in a political science class. All right. Is it clear what I'm asking you to do? I need to get a witness here. I need to know for sure. This is why I hate those dead screens. I get no reaction. I don't know who's even paying attention. Okay, so by next week, everyone's got a camera. That camera's on. Clean your room up. Do whatever. I mean, you'll notice I've cleaned mine up, and we'll talk about the four assigned readings for Module 1, and then we'll talk a little bit about the written assignment that I want you to do. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, then I need to stick around and talk to one of your colleagues. Other than that, go ahead and log out, and I will see you next week.
Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Bye.
Okay, microphone. You're muted.
There's the, yeah, there it is. I was trying to press the, anyway, I only have a other thing. I was wondering if I could drop in on, no, I've forgotten the name of the class.
371?
Yes,
Why
that's
are you
it.
dropping in? Why don't you take it?
Actually, I could just take it too, actually.
Take
I
the
was wondering if I
goddamn
should.
class. You're gonna
I
love it.
probably should. Yeah, I probably should. I was thinking of taking a class of Patterson, but I don't think I can. I don't think it lines up with my schedule. But
Well, I'm not going to say who. No, there is a student who's enrolled in that class who has to take another class at the same time.
okay.
I mean, I'm recording. It's better than nothing, but I would love to have your contributions, but I don't want you to take it for nothing. And you know what? It's not going to be that hard. It's a lot of it is, I mean, we're going back in time where it's old normative philosophy and stuff like that, but I think you would dig it.
Yeah, I think I might just, because I think you can, I don't know, I haven't really ever signed for classes late, but
It's no big deal.
anyway.
Now,
I'll do
if you
that.
have a time
Yeah.
conflict, you're going to have to get another instructor, whatever class that would be, to give you a pass in it, or I would do it.
Yeah. One thing I will say is that it might actually be open because Dustin isn't really doing any Zoom. Give me 1 second if I can actually, I should have actually scrolled up to the.
Hold on just a second. Damn it, I'm sorry. I should have done this before.